Great. Well, first of all, thank you to the League, to the jury, to the people in the audience. I think Susanna mentioned some of the alumni and some of the former students whom I've had the pleasure of teaching, the family, the friends. I think that really, even though we're a small studio based in Miami, we kind of reflect a little bit of that optimism of what the city aspires to be as it reinvents itself. And I think that this image is a photo I took not that long ago, kind of captures this interesting collision between the natural environment, sort of the built world and the natural world, and how these two collide in fascinating ways. So a lot of the work that I'm involved with actually has to do with trying to tease out the inherent power that these moments have. And a lot of it has to do with just the act of documentation, which is why, as Susanna mentioned, this is an important part of our practice. This is a photo of one of my kids actually playing with a fire, a sparkler. And the choice of how long the exposure and how, in the end, this suggests this kind of three-dimensional space, even though it's a very ephemeral moment, in a way I find very striking and somewhat compatible with the way landscape architecture works. Whereas if you can decide up front how to tweak that exposure, you're able to capture amazing subtleties that are, even though they might seem minimal, are absolutely transcendental. So this kind of also relates to a former life. I actually was a naval officer years ago, and I had the amazing experience of sailing this tall ship for about 7 months. And one of the things that I think stayed with me during those times is, again, this power of how, when you have to have such an economy of means in such a limited environment, you're still able to make these amazing sort of trajectories that, in a way, exist very powerfully on the surface of water, perhaps the most ephemeral of all things, and have it be extremely powerful, but also have it know that it'll only be there briefly. So I think I try to pull that into the work, and just in our arrival to Miami, this was about maybe a week or so before Katrina hit. We had 3 hurricanes that year in 2005. And this big ficus trunk, I'll back up, this was deposited in our front yard. And there was an opportunity to kind of rethink, this destruction or debris. I thought, I'm from Puerto Rico originally, and I knew hurricanes, but I'd kind of forgotten the power and the biomass that it just generates through that act of destruction, which ultimately, 6 months afterwards, at first I thought, the city will never recover. But 6 months later, the subtropics have this amazing resilience, and it springs back. And so this is actually a set of prints that I did using that trunk, this big, heavy trunk. And what I find interesting about it is, again, that act of documentation tells stories. And here it might be how the timing, I guess, of the cut indicates sort of the process by which this tree or this trunk was broken down. So it's in choosing to document certain ways, you can kind of reenact and reverse engineer the story of how, in this case, this living thing is deconstructed. And so again, it's about those stories, and in many ways those stories are written. I've chosen the map. From my grad years at RISD, I became enamored with printmaking, and this came later. These were a series of very simple prints that trace the section of the Napa Valley in California, and through writing and just simple documentation, I tried to write and to put down on paper the trajectories of turkey vultures up in the air and boulders that define that very unique part of the world. And so that act of documentation here is taking a traditional map and then, which I drew and painted, and then adding impressions as to what the qualities of the earth were, the quality of the lighting, etc. And here, this is kind of a low-tech GIS. This is a plate of a city that I was studying in Central America, in Nicaragua at the time. And then overlaying a second plate with ink, which I subsequently flooded. I took the river plate and the city plate, superimposed them, and this shed some light and some insights as to the evolution of the city, again, through a very low-tech simulation. So I went on after that to work in larger scale, and the print was developed into this idea of a land print, which is basically a one-to-one impression of the landscape. And I did this in the Naval Shipyard where I had my studio in the West Coast. This is a shipyard that closed in 1995, known as Mare Island. And what's fascinating about it is that as any large piece of infrastructure that's left untouched, there's this process of decay. To allow things to not decay requires an immense amount of energy. Here, the decay of steel, cranes, and shipyards was very evident. And so these land prints actually were placed in three predominant, or kind of prototypical conditions. A staging yard, a dry dock, and right on the edge where ships used to come in on a pier. And they were one-to-one. They're steel plates. This is about 4 foot by 4 foot. And I let them sit there for a couple of months. And over time, they began to transform. I left them alone and then pulled them up from the ground, and I painted. The red here is sort of the highlights of things that I identified as interesting on the surface of the print. And actually, it's a choice that one makes when you make a map. It's actually quite a subjective exercise. And so here, what became evident, and something that I really didn't plan at the beginning, is the fact that in this process of documentation, what is clear is the presence of water. So the series is called Everything is a River, because the water, you can see the advancing and the receding of water edges. You know, these very sort of crisp understanding that we might have of where land ends and water begins are somehow revealed to be quite shifty and quite blurred. And to me, that's one of these fascinating moments, or fascinating potentials of landscape architecture, is to explore these juxtapositions. It also, through this print, it also kind of got to the idea of what is a landscape, or what is our idea of landscape. So when a plate sits on the land, it's basically part of the land. The moment that you remove it, it reflects a one-to-one scale impression of that landscape. And in a way, I like to think of it as that big bang moment when the idea of landscape begins. And again, it's an exploration, it's a process of exploration of a print, basically an act of documentation. The redwood forest in California was also one of these amazing environments, these are magnificent sequoia trees that can be 300, 400, 500 feet tall. Being out there in that landscape, it becomes very difficult to kind of comprehend scale, and so I sketched these the simplest way of sketching, just through line weight, through a little bit more information that shows branching, through foliage, through the qualities of light, and basically through sketch, trying to deconstruct this very massive environment. But actually it was through photography and through this kind of, again, this intentional delay in exposure and panning the camera in the grain of the forest that made these impressions, which at the end of the day, they almost look like paintings. And I don't think that that's coincidental. In a way, it's somewhat of an impression of this landscape and the qualities of light that ultimately are what allows us to access our understanding of a place in order to act on it and to design upon it. So these different projects are a way of kind of getting in to the essence of a place. And so that's why I've chosen these projects before I get into the more traditional projects that we've been working on for some time. So the last of these is an installation, and through the studio, the idea of installations as temporary, almost three-dimensional sketches is very important. First of all, it empowers you in the process of design. There's no sense of sort of fear, in a way. And here, actually, I'll back up. This I convinced an ice fabricator in Hialeah to let me freeze rose petals inside 400-pound blocks of ice. And this was done in collaboration with Performance from a group from Latin America who uses a similar geometry as part of their theater productions. And so they use rose petals on the ground. I use them in ice. And then I proceeded to document over the course of 24 hours this, again, striking juxtaposition of, the palms and the ice and the slow deposition of these forms on the landscape, how they create microclimates, how they create this very unexpected subtlety of what I call an ice mapping. So here, of course, the ice melts, but then in the end, you have a trace that is reflected in that very strong, very identifiable geometry. In a walk in Miami at Florida International University, where I teach and share the landscape department, you see moments like this, rather banal, but then this is actually a bottle brush tree, a callistemon, and every season it drops these very sort of bright red flowers. And just that difference, that slight difference of a couple of inches of lawn elevation to sidewalk means that you have this highlighted moment that was not designed, but if you observe, you can certainly use that, and I plan to hopefully use that in the future. But again, it's about this act or this process of observation. And so that takes us to the first project. The Sky Lounge in Miami, this has been in place now for about a year and a half. And it's a very important building. It's the second building of the university, which every semester has about 13,000 students who take courses here, not to mention faculty and events. The Sky Lounge is adjacent to a lot of the public spaces and a lot of the administrative buildings of the university. So it gets quite a bit of traffic. Unfortunately, for about 8 or 9 years before anything was done, this is what it looked like. It has a dramatic skylight up above, but the ground plane was never a public space. Quite the contrary, it was quite off-putting. This is as good as it got, just a little paint on the walls and red mulch and concrete. So the university commissioned me to design this, and of course the interest is in having minimal maintenance. And so you look to the context of Miami. These are epiphytes. It's a type of bromeliad known as an air plant. They require no soil. They basically absorb the nutrients from the humidity in the air. And you see them and you become familiar with them in Miami because of how, after every storm, a few fall on the ground and they have these incredible textures and colors that change throughout the year. They attach themselves to a pre-existing infrastructure, oftentimes of tree branches and leaves, etc. So it was a perfect opportunity to use this out of concern for the university to create something that would not mean a whole lot of maintenance. And so we selected 7 species, diagrammed the locations of these, and then proceeded to design a space that would serve flexibly. To the left here, these are loose chairs that you can arrange for impromptu gatherings, for lectures, and then 2 benches that face each other and create a micro courtyard, I guess, in the middle. And then as you get closer and as you look, it has these tall nets. Again, one of the most fascinating things about that space, even though it was really not friendly, is the drama of that 4-story height. And a way of taking advantage of that was to use lightweight mesh structures that would then would sit inside that space and transform it, while at the same time having a level of transparency to them. That in combination with the benches below, these are not intended to be independent sort of furnishings, but rather the profile, and I'll show that in a moment, is designed to work in unison with the section. So the 3 systems here, basically the gray, which is all the concrete and the steel, the middle, the green, the vegetation, and the right, these purple blooming flowers of sky blue vine, the crushed glass, recycled glass underfoot, because the site used to flood. The skylight above has some leak issues, so this is a way to mitigate that, and of course bringing in the sky into it. So these, I found out later, this is actually crushed sky vodka bottles, so that was that's not why I named it the Sky Lounge, by the way, but it was kind of fun. So a lot of the work really is just begins with a sketch, and the profile here again was intended to be very flexible. And so we built prototypes out of plywood and PVC that would let you lean, sit on the edge, recline, and ultimately this is the profile that drives the design because it's the one that connects most directly with what's above you, which are these nets. Talk to your neighbor, lean on the back, basically using that shape to curate public interactions. And so these nets were shipped to us. Each one of them weighs about 200 pounds. And I harken back to my Navy days and block and tackle and pulleys, and we put one up every day. And we started every 6 feet. We used over 20, I think we had over 20 student volunteers and family. My wife, who's in the audience, was part of that as well, our kids. And little by little, we hoisted these and placed them into the space. And what happens is, over time, this is actually fast forward a year and a half later, you have this filigree infrastructure that just hovers over the space. We chose a vine that's very aggressive. It felt really appropriate for a space that was 1974 Brutalist architecture that was quite off-putting because it had nothing else around it. And so these vines have taken over with a trellis system that we placed on the walls. And even though these volumes are quite gigantic, they're 36 feet tall, they're 7 feet at the top in diameter and 16 feet at the bottom, they allow for you to look through. And over time, these air plants, they propagate 1 to 3 different shoots every year. So little by little, it'll become denser. But it also suggests a volume without getting in the way of being heavy volume. So there's kind of an interesting ephemerality to the project and to the work that little by little adds to itself. Views in at the different levels of the courtyard, you really get a different experience of this project. And then views up, really, this is when you're lying down on the bench and looking up. And then, of course, people using it in many different ways. We put a significant amount of outlets, Wi-Fi. So it's a place to recharge literally, but also figuratively. And I think my favorite is this juxtaposition of the before on the left and the after. This is before the vegetation really filled in on the right, but still was quite powerful transformation. A project that kind of paralleled the Sky Lounge is this botanical garden in Colombia. And in a way, these two projects worked hand in hand. And you will see why the prototyping happens at FIU. But this is an image of a coffee plantation that closed in 1995. It had been in existence for almost 100 years. And in visiting this place, you have an existing creek. You have canals that were built to tap into that and move through the site to create microclimates. You have river edges that have these amazing timber bamboos. Hacienda house that is LEED Platinum Plus, I'm sure. Views out, views in, coffee. You really have to take the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, when you begin in a site like this. But the most interesting thing about it was that you had this infrastructure of a coffee processing facility, a 3-level structure that used gravity and used hydrological power to operate. Right now, these are missing the leather belts that are normally attached to a pulley system like this. But in my first site visit, the caretaker takes us and he asks the group to step back. And he opens a valve and water rushes in, and this entire building started to just churn and move and breathe. And the cistern that had all that energy, all that water, would move through, and these pulleys would take the coffee that was gathered on the ground floor, moved that all the way up to the top floor where it would be toasted, and then progressively moved back down to the ground floor where it would be bagged and shipped. And so to me, this was a revelation. It also happens to be in one of Colombia's most fertile regions for nurseries and coffee. And so the city council and the mayor wanted to have this place, this botanical garden, be a reflection of all those industries. So the industries came together to provide funding for the nursery, for the various pavilions, for a museum pavilion that was part of it, as well as for the demonstration gardens and for the entire operation. So again, this begins with a sketch, and here you have this amazing site, and this is the evolution of the site from the sketch to the final drawing, and I'll go through the different components of it. Some of the strategies really had to do with establishing through the general master planning zones adjacent to the creek that would be more rustic. The blue in the middle would be where the coffee museum and the processing center would be, and then the agritourism would happen on the lavender area in the lower right, and then the actual pavilion with the demonstration gardens would be on the far left. But really what united this entire site, over 15 acres of it, was water, because historically the water had been the vehicle with which this place operated, not only for the irrigation of their crops, but also for the microclimates of living. And so that remained as an important priority. But also because they wanted to create this as a destination, it was important to create a striking statement, I guess, something that they could grab onto and advertise. And so looking at the site, looking at the way the architecture breathes openly, the bromeliads, again, became a vehicle for these bromeliariums. And you might recognize this sketch. This is a sketch on the plane coming back. And it actually mimics or replicates the idea that an oak, in this case, or any other tree, is the original infrastructure onto which other living systems attach, and hence unravel this series of relationships. But creating these hybrid trees, or these nets that would be placed in the middle of the forest as part of an elevated path is actually a strategy that connects with the inherent quality of the site in this dense rainforest environment, and also the need for human beings to be attracted, inspired, intrigued by a new landscape. And so the nets here are freestanding, unlike the Sky Lounge, and they begin with a series of bromeliads and orchids, and over time the concept is that they become denser and denser as birds and animals start to use them for nesting and whatnot. It's also quite a dramatic moment when people move through it, and you can see in the rendering here, this path cuts right through one of the structures. The other component is the exaggeration of scale, in this case of using native textures and colors and water. And in the edge of the pavilion, you have this commanding view because the site slopes from east to west. And out in the landscape, you had we designed these pods that, in the distance, you can see bamboo structures that use the timber as a tensile member. Generally, in this part of Colombia, the bamboo is used for construction, but it's mostly to replicate existing architecture. So you see like mansard or hip roofs done in bamboo. Here, we wanted to use the bamboo to create outdoor classrooms and propagation centers or propagation sites, etc., but use those materials that were grown on the site directly. And then using the foreground of these ponds and the flowers to exaggerate the scales of color, almost as if a butterfly or a bee might see it, but in this case, for people. So in the sequence here, this is the entrance that shows from right to left how you would enter the site from the public space and then go through a market, go through a series of curated temporary gardens, and then on the left here, this is the pavilion, museum pavilion, the market, and then these temporary gardens in the middle. The views out all are predicated, and the logic of the site are all predicated on a series of axes that take advantage of the water. So here you have a site that slopes from east to west, and you walk down the slope, and you're actually on a roof terrace with the views out onto the landscape beyond. And you're a little bit you're exposed to that inherent beauty of the existing landscape. You're just creating those opportunities, and through a series of axes, not only is the trajectory of water emphasized, but also the building materials as well. This other axis is the axis of bamboo. So you would go from the edge of the creek where the bamboo grows naturally on one end of that axis to the other end where it becomes architecture. So the landscape becomes almost like a didactic tool, and that was one of the mandates, I guess, or conceptually that we were interested in. Also the idea that through temporary gardens, you can have things like the gardens of Claude Comier and things that you find in France, the Chemin-sur-Loire, but you would use this in a very specific part of the landscape so that people know that every time they visit, they can see something new. The coffee route similarly takes you through the coffee plantation, through the process of coffee collection, toasting, and ultimately consumption. So the entire site is sort of threaded with these ideas, and then on the edge of the creek, these are more rustic, but it also introduces a series of very exciting adventure type of sports such as zip lining, so that the botanical garden becomes not just the domain of the botanists and the folks who live and breathe that world, but also becomes an attractive environment for the public, which was the idea of this place to begin with. On the interactive pavilion, I worked with actually a former student who started her practice with her husband, Lopez Jaimes, great group actually from Colombia. And what I asked them to do was to take, I wanted to create both the science and the art of botany and place them on one plane. And it had to have water moving through it. And so on one side of the pavilion, it has an open courtyard space. On the left, you see the researchers studying botany, and it's almost part of an exhibit. On the right, you have the art of botany, and these two things are connected with water through this courtyard. And then as you walk down the hill, you have people up top who can look into the space. And then the programming is designed in such a way that the green icons here are opportunities for it to be economically sustainable. So gift shops, restaurants, etc. An important priority for me to be able to communicate to the client that it's not just about the aesthetics, but also about the practicality of long-term sustainability. The reason why that project came about actually was a result of this research, which I've been involved with for a number of years. It's a project I call the Ecological Atlas. And this is the part of the studio where technology meets art, and every year, I see dozens of books that get published on, living systems, trees, garden books, etc. But there really is, while there's a need to know this, and we certainly are sort of impinging on, our growth of our cities and the fact that many people now live in cities, more than half the world's population, and all the infrastructures that that make that a tense sort of environment as it is in the subtropics, means that using technology has to, we need to embrace technology in a field that, in my opinion, landscape architecture, could use a lot of revamping, I guess, of its tools, and I think we're moving in that right direction. And in the research that I've been doing, which focuses, like our program at FIU, in the tropics and the subtropics, this is about 3 of the 7 billion people who live in the world now are in this band, and that's projected to go up to 6 billion by 2100. So the things that we study in the tropics and the subtropics in our program are really issues of the world and of the great majority of the world. And so the Ecological Atlas, its premise is that for most of the public, perhaps, that natural environment might seem like something completely foreign and inscrutable. But what if there were tools that allowed you to look at that section and then suddenly have an intuitive understanding of how it behaves? And so here, these diagrams we've developed over the years show the calendar on the x-axis, January to December, and it shows the various species as they move through the calendar. So if you were to, for example, look at this yellow tree, the tababuya, and be able to see yellow blooming tree out in the landscape, you would be able to then, in a reverse intuitive way, understand and drill down into it so that you can get information about that landscape. Of course, it's a tool that allows you to understand it, but also to design it better. And so here, for example, you can take that flower like we've done. This is a native Florida wildflower. And it takes the data of its bloom times and all this metadata, water use, sun exposure, etc., catalogs it. And in this case, they're arranged by color, where the y-axis here is the calendar, and the native flowers are shown from left to right. And so we take that, and the power of combining data with design and the natural environment is that once you have that information here, you can sort it according to any criteria. So in this case, the sorting happens according to bloom time. So you have early bloomers on the far left and late bloomers on the far right. But you could do this for any number of things. If you wanted to have a landscape that bloomed white for your anniversary, or for any other reason, for minimum maintenance, things that you could find locally, all of this is data that ultimately can be used to design, maintain, grow, and better engage the natural environment. It's based on quite a bit of under-the-hood research. This is a glimpse at one of our databases of plants. But the powerful thing is that this information is out there. And so through this project, we're able to kind of bring the sensibilities that we have as artists and designers and combine it with the need of growth and development in our cities and in our time. So here, a very simple diagram that shows what fruits are in season could help you decide what to buy when. We've done cataloging of butterflies over, over 150. I think one of my associates could probably get that number for us, but we've done 350 birds, all based in South Florida. And again, you can index this so that when you click on it, you can understand the habitat, the sound, ultimately the way that your natural environment works in ways that you might not have otherwise understood. What's interesting about that project is that to date, I've had an exhibit at museums, and if you know Miami, you know that this gigantic art fair, Art Basel, and its satellite fairs generate billions of dollars every year. I've been invited to show it in art venues, and people respond to it immediately. They intuitively understand time and the landscape. But it's been shown as art, and so and I love that. But I think that as we turn the corner with the project, it becomes a tool, so that in images like this, you can see the typical plant communities, coastal communities, and you can understand not just plants in their individual and flora and fauna in their individual sort of context, but you start to understand how they work together and how they change. Depending on the geographic location. Which brings me to the Wynwood Greenhouse, which is a project that we're currently doing. I have the great fortune of working with some amazingly talented colleagues, Nick Jelpy, Jim Drain, and myself, an architect, an artist, and a landscape architect, and we submitted to this competition, which was interestingly sponsored by a developer who saw a way of looking at development in kind of a unique way. And I think this is why it's an exciting project for Miami. And I think this developer has given us an opportunity to kind of rethink this relationship of how our trajectory as a city. And so the Wynwood Greenhouse was a name that we called it, even though it's really not a greenhouse. It's completely open to the environment. And In this case, it's a structure that mimics what in this neighborhood of Wynwood you had residential and industrial basically colliding for many years. It was run down. This was a site of a lot of unrest and kind of underserved areas for many, many years. But it has become, in the way that Miami completely astonishes every other year, has become this absolute highly coveted real estate market where these sites are getting built and the return has been really substantial. A lot of it has been led through art, actually, through a series of art initiatives. Wynwood Walls is this project that basically allowed for artists to come in and paint murals onto the walls. And so this competition allowed for a new public space in Wynwood. And this is what our tagline for it, a living framework onto which human activities and natural ecologies can attach and adapt. And so what you're seeing here is a structure that's completely open, and that inside it houses native plants that cater to native flora and fauna, birds and primarily butterflies, and the public. And so it's extremely flexible in its design. It allows for anything from fashion shows to orchestras to farmers markets, and it just creates that space for the public. Part of our work has been to take a look at a catalog of native flora and fauna, and then design these vertical green walls that are fine-tuned to its geographic context. This is a diagram that shows water consumption. So we have basically an infrastructure to allow us to put these plants in almost like gabion walls. And these are stacked and filled in, and almost like in a way that in the future one will be able to modularly add or remove depending on how things work. But it's also taking a catalog of wildflowers and designing it in very much the way that I described with the Eco Atlas, and breaking down that original list of plants into plants that are host on one side of the structure, nectar on the other. Butterflies need to host caterpillars and put larvae in, and they need the nectar plants to grow and flourish. And so the greenhouse becomes a place for these things to coexist. And then we take that and we start to break it down into relationships so that we have designed a structure that caters to very specific species. And those species ultimately answer to the physical environment, to the architectural environment. And this is one isolated representation of that. But ultimately, it's about creating many multiple new relationships through, through the choices that we're making, we're designing into this project. And so I'd like to finish, and let me see if the video here comes up, with a video that we did to win the competition. And this was a requirement. It's a 5-minute or less video. And you'll see what I mean, and I'll conclude after that. So that'll give you a glimpse of what Miami will hopefully be looking like in the not too distant future. So we see ourselves, we see our small practice, our growing practice as a place where these kinds of experiments can happen, great collaborations can happen. And I think we're in a place that allows us to imagine these things, to think really boldly about the future. Miami's not that old, it's a little over 100 years old. And I think that also kind of colors this entrepreneurial and emergent spirit of the city. It's I think, an exciting time regardless of where you are with design, and the ability to combine the technologies and the tools that we have available. I think that we try to show that it's really a continuity of thought, a continuity of process, and the better that you are in understanding that from the beginning, the more powerful that your influence will be over time. Thank you.